Welcome to the spine-tingling world of our unholy tales, where fear takes its darkest form and every shadow holds a chilling secret. We are your guides through the twisted and nightmarish tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat, clutching your pillow for dear life. Get ready to embark on a journey into the abyss of your deepest fears as we explore the realms of the supernatural, the macabre, and the unknown. When the Parker family moved from the bustling streets of Chicago to the sleepy Midwestern town of Willow Creek, they were looking forward to a quieter, simpler life. Jonathan Parker had recently inherited an old farmhouse just outside of town from his late uncle, and it seemed like the perfect opportunity to remove his wife, Emma, and their 3 children, Tom, age 12, Mary, age 6, and little baby Jack, from the noise and pollution of the big city. The farmhouse was large but dilapidated, with peeling paint, creaky floorboards, and overgrown vegetation creeping up the sides. But it also had character that couldn't be found back in Chicago. Arched doorways, a sprawling front porch, and 6 bedrooms upstairs for the children to explore. Behind the house was an old barn that leaned slightly to the left, but could still provide shelter and storage. The first week passed quickly for the Parkers as they worked sunup to sundown, scrubbing floors, patching walls, and making the old farmhouse livable again. 12-year-old Tom even braved the eerie basement to tidy up, shuffling stacks of old furniture and farming equipment to clear space. Emma busied herself turning the dusty kitchen into a warm space for the family to gather, and baby Jack napped soundly in the front sitting room while the activity whisked around him. By the end of the week, the Parkers had rid the farmhouse of years of grime and neglect, and the place was finally starting to feel like home. The night before Jonathan had to return to Chicago to wrap up business at his old office, the couple rested in their new bedroom with moonlight streaming in through the windows. Emma snuggled up against her husband happily. "Just think, in a few weeks you'll be done with the city for good, and this place will truly be ours," she said optimistically. They exchanged smiles before drifting off into a peaceful sleep, the day's hard work finally catching up to them. Outside, the wind picked up driving leaves across the creaky front porch. A candle extinguished itself on a windowsill. And upstairs, Tom was still awake late into the evening, thumbing through an old book he had found tucked away in a forgotten corner downstairs. Ink symbols decorated the yellowed pages, the shapes of which Tom had never seen. His eyelids grew heavy until he finally blew out his oil lamp and tucked the strange book under his mattress, falling asleep almost instantly. The next day, Jonathan said his goodbyes before making the long journey back to Chicago. The children played outside chasing the chickens while Emma tended her new garden. But that evening at dinner, Emma noticed Tom barely touched his food, his face pale as he pushed potatoes around his plate. "Tom, honey, are you feeling all right?" Emma asked, feeling his forehead for a fever. Tom nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm okay. Just tired," he mumbled, his eyes not meeting hers. Emma glanced outside as the last rays of light disappeared over the horizon. "All right, kids, up to bed with you then," she said, clearing the plates. As Tom lay in bed, remnants of strange dreams echoed through his mind. Dreams of floating through blackness, distant voices chanting words he couldn't understand. He tossed and turned throughout the night, uncertain what was fact or fiction. In the morning, Tom stumbled downstairs with dark circles under his eyes. Emma set a heaping plate of eggs and ham in front of the boy, kissing his head fondly before returning to the stove. But once again, Tom simply picked at his food. As the days passed, he became more withdrawn and sullen. Dark veins appeared at his temples, and the bones of his cheeks and neck seemed more prominent. Emma began seriously worrying about her son, but whenever Dr. Barrows came to call, he found nothing physically wrong with the boy. Late one evening while threshing beans, Emma saw a faint glow coming through Tom's second-story bedroom window. She quietly climbed the stairs, peering into her son's room, where she saw Tom sitting cross-legged on his bed, hovering over a candle, foreign words spewing from his lips as he read aloud from a book, the mysterious book from the basement. Emma watched in horror as the flame grew higher with each word until it licked the ceiling, Tom's eyes rolled back and body convulsing violently. Without thinking, Emma burst through the door and snatched the book from Tom's trembling hands, throwing it forcefully into the roaring fireplace down the hall. Tom let out an unearthly howl as his mother held him tightly, the candle guttering out, leaving them in darkness. Emma took Tom's tear-stained face into her hands. "My sweet boy, what have you done?" she whispered in anguish. Over the next week, Tom returned to his normal, cheerful self, and Emma simply dismissed the strange incident as an overactive imagination. But she still shuddered, remembering the power and rage in her sweet son's face that night. Summer arrived with soaring temperatures and drought, yet the corn should have still been knee-high by the 4th of July. Instead, Jonathan and Emma's crop remained stunted and feeble no matter how much care and water was provided. One afternoon, while inspecting the corn, Emma stumbled onto an unnatural sight that made her blood turn to ice. A deer lay motionless in their field, its body grey and shriveled like all moisture had been drained from its very cells. Where its belly was exposed, the skin had been peeled back, revealing shrunken organs untouched by predators. But the animal's glassy eyes remained wide in an eternal expression of terror. The Parkers also began noticing wilted trees and unusual illnesses around town. Young, robust men were passing unexpectedly from sudden organ failure. Cattle were born deformed, entire hives of bees drained of life. Emma traded uneasy glances with the local farmers' wives when passing at the market or in church, everyone knowing something unnatural was occurring but too fearful to speak of it aloud. Summer slowly turned to fall, and the Parkers celebrated a modest harvest with Thanksgiving fast approaching. One rare sunny morning, Jonathan decided to bundle up baby Jack and take him outside, hoping the fresh air would strengthen his unusually gaunt frame. Emma returned inside to begin supper preparations, while Tom and Mary played a quiet game of marbles by the fire. After some time passed, Emma realized she hadn't heard gurgling baby laughs coming from outside her open kitchen window. "Jack always loves playing peekaboo behind the wood pile," she said absently to the children. "I better go check and make sure your father isn't hiding too long." Stepping out onto the front porch, she saw Jonathan frozen near the chopping stump. Facing the woods and clutching Jack closely to his chest, she raced over. "What's wrong?" she cried, reaching to take Jack from his hands. She stifled a scream as Jonathan turned towards her with Jack now lying grey and limp across his arms, mouth open in a silent wail and eyes glassy and dull like the dead deer's. Later that terrible night, after the children were finally asleep, Jonathan held his weeping wife, knowing no words could console her. As tendrils of snow brushed up against the window panes, it almost drowned out the sound of creaking floorboards from down the hall. They raised their heads and listened to slow, rhythmic steps creaking on the wooden floors, coming up the stairs, towards the bedroom. Jonathan leapt up and flung open the door. Tom stood there glassy-eyed before collapsing to the ground. The next morning, Dr. Barrows arrived to find Tom remained alive, but cold and barely breathing. "Doc, it's like he's in a coma, yet he was fine just yesterday evening," Jonathan said, shaking his head in disbelief. The physician's brow furrowed with concern as he prepared medicine. "Jonathan, Emma, I haven't wanted to worry you unduly, but there has been increased talk around town about strange illnesses descending on us all," Dr. Barrows said gravely. "And, I'm ashamed to admit, I have felt powerless treating the symptoms because they don't seem natural." Emma covered her face with her hands, weeping, thinking of her sweet, lively Jack, now buried in the frosty cornfield. Dr. Barrows stayed late into the night as Tom thrashed feverishly in bed, powerful convulsions racking his weakened body while Emma mopped his brow. Near midnight, he reluctantly announced he could do no more good there. As the doctor prepared to leave, Jonathan pulled him aside out of Emma's earshot. "I haven't had the heart to tell Emma since we lost Jack," he whispered. "But I swear to God, Doc, when I found the baby, there was something in those woods watching me. Some kind of figure, barely the shape of a man, something evil." Dr. Barrow's eyes widened. Before dawn, Emma rested fitfully in bed, while Tom seemed finally to be at peace. Suddenly she was startled awake by the loud slamming of the front door. Peering out the window, she saw Jonathan's silhouette crossing the yard towards the woods, axe in hand and movements stiffly deliberate. "Jonathan!" Emma screamed, throwing on her robe and stumbling outside after her husband. "What are you doing out here? Get back inside. There's something dangerous out there." Jonathan continued striding towards the barren cornfields without turning back. His axe glinted in the pale moonlight. "I have to end this," was all he said. "Jonathan, stop!" Emma pleaded, trailing behind him barefoot in the cold dirt. She glanced fearfully at the forbidding dark tree line. "I know we lost our sweet baby boy, but we still have Mary and Tom who need their father. Please, Jonathan, listen to me." Suddenly, Jonathan stopped and turned to Emma with a terrifying expression. "We lost Jack because of me," he choked out. "I brought this evil on our family when I unearthed that cursed book last month in the basement. This is all my doing." Emma stumbled backwards, realizing with dawning horror that Jonathan had unleashed something wicked from one of the strange books Tom had found in the basement weeks earlier. The pieces suddenly fell into place. Tom's bizarre behavior, the supernatural sickness creeping across their land. Before she could react, Jonathan turned abruptly and continued marching towards the barren fields. Emma's lungs burned against the cold night air as she struggled to keep up with her crazed husband. "It doesn't have to be this way," she cried desperately. "We can fight this together, as a family." But Jonathan was deaf to her pleas as he strode purposely into the lifeless cornstalks shrouded in low-lying fog. He raised his axe definitively over his head without breaking stride. Emma suddenly halted at the forest edge, peering helplessly into the gloom between the narrow, barren husks. She heard Jonathan's determined shout turn suddenly to a shuddering scream of terror that ripped through the night air, immediately silenced. "No!" Emma collapsed into wrenching sobs, her mind unable to accept losing Jonathan mere weeks after their baby boy Jack was cruelly taken from them. The woods remained terrifyingly silent, except for the rustling of dead corn in the breeze. Suddenly, from behind her back at the farmhouse, she heard Mary's helpless cries calling for her parents. Emma turned desperately towards the house, just as movement in the corner of her eye stopped her short. There, between the withered cornstalks, she watched two dead, glowing eyes slowly turn towards her. Emma's heart seized in her chest. Without daring to breathe, she began slowly backing away towards the house, keeping the thin, corpse-like figure in sight. Once inside, she barricaded the door behind her, then raced to Mary, who was shrieking hysterically halfway down the staircase. Emma scooped the little girl into her arms and rushed her upstairs. Inside Tom's bedroom, she found that haunted relic from the basement, the Book of Symbols, tucked under his pillow. Emma quickly grabbed 3 small bags, then herded both children into the root cellar out back, detouring only long enough to fill a pot full of rendered fat from a shelf in the pantry. She then latched the heavy wooden storm doors behind them and sat holding Tom and Mary tightly. Outside, the first scream of that horrible creature echoed faintly on the night wind. Soon, others quickly joined in a nightmarish chorus surrounding the farmhouse. Hour after interminable hour, Emma kept her frightened children huddled close as the screams grew closer and more numerous outside. She clawed nervously at the 3 small bags she had hastily packed. Suddenly, sharp claws scraped against the outside wooden cellar doors. The screams stopped instantly. From upstairs floorboards began creaking under slow, heavy footsteps. Emma breathed a silent prayer. This old root cellar would serve as their asylum. The steps skulked slowly through the house as dishware crashed in the kitchen above them. Floorboards groaned above their heads as it searched the house. Once it stopped for several agonizing minutes in the room directly over their hiding place. Finally, just as hope began to flicker once again in Emma's heart, there was a loud crash directly on top of the cellar doors. Dust showered down on them as Mary whimpered against her mother. Tom and Emma remained paralyzed in fear as the footsteps retreated from the splintered doors towards the far side of the house. For the first time in hours, Emma exhaled deeply and gave her frightened children the most reassuring smile she could muster. "If we stay brave, we may yet see your father again," she whispered with false confidence. But they would have to wait many more agonizing hours cowering in the dank cellar before the first rays of dawn finally crept over the horizon. As the first rooster crowed, Emma helped a weakened Tom climb the creaking stairs. Peering cautiously outside, Emma found no sign of the demonic attackers anywhere. The rising sun revealed a surrounding cornfield littered with dead crows that had dropped inexplicably from the sky. As they crept towards the farmyard, Emma dreaded what they would discover, but no trace remained of poor Jonathan. Nearing the porch, they froze suddenly at the sight of something on their doorstep. Mary whimpered as Emma reached with a quivering hand to retrieve a raw slab of meat resting on bloody wax paper. It was her husband's severed hand with wedding ring still attached to Jonathan's bloated finger. Overcome with shock and grief, Emma retreated inside, gathering the children close to her pounding heart. But she knew their death warrant had now been signed. It would be back again tonight to finish them off. She quickly gathered supplies to prepare for their last stand against the demonic force from which no man seemed able to defend his family. As dusk settled around the farmhouse, Emma made Tom and Mary drink a bitter sleeping tonic, then kissed their foreheads as they drifted off. Alone now, she turned her attention to the Book of Arcane Symbols. Downstairs, she carefully arranged pieces of furniture to barricade herself inside the sitting room. Working deliberately despite her terror, she poured fat into a deep bowl, then painstakingly copied strange shapes from the book onto the floor using wax from broken candles. She glanced nervously out the window as distant shrieks echoed from the woods, heralding the approaching darkness. Soon, hundreds of glowing eyes peered at her from the edge of the cornfield, first motionlessly, then agitatedly, as unearthly wails echoed through the walls of the farmhouse. Emma sat with quiet dignity inside her summoning circle as the ritual took form, a final desperate act to protect her remaining children upstairs. Beads of sweat dripped down her neck, despite the unnatural chill settling through the room. Gasping screams outside turned to shrieks of agony. The windows darkened from writhing masses of demons. Furniture smashed against the doors as Emma recited the last words of the ancient text flawlessly. Her hand trembled as she held the fateful wooden match above wax-drenched floorboards. Glancing up, she watched a corpse-white face materialize, screaming at her through the window from hollow sockets. With tears streaming down her face, she dropped the match, then closed her eyes peacefully as flames roared throughout the room. The next morning, Tom and Mary found themselves in the county hospital, with vague memories of the smoking farmhouse ruins. Having no family left, all that prevented the orphans from the poorhouse was wealthy widow Abigail Marsh from town, who brought them back to her estate on the edge of Willow Creek. Her grandson Samuel begrudgingly made space in the nursery for the two Parker children. As Abigail showed the children to their new beds, they passed a shelf lined with leather-bound books and strange artifacts that gave Tom a sense of unease and familiarity. From downstairs, a rooster's crow was cut short by a strange gargling cry. Tom peered out the window as Mrs. Marsh left the room, noticing a dead bird lying by the old well outside. Suddenly, an intense headache gripped Tom, who excused himself to lay down until dinner. Staring at the ceiling, he struggled to recall urgent warnings from his mother. but they faded like smoke through his fingers. Meanwhile, downstairs, Mrs. Marsh opened a dust-covered book illuminated with odd glyphs. A faint smile curled on her thin lips as she flipped greedily through decaying pages. Glancing up, her pale blue eyes honed unnaturally on the ceiling towards the nursery. "Welcome home, my children," she whispered.